Good evening. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. Thank you so much for inviting us into your homes tonight. It's always a special treat to reconnect with Hillwood members and also to meet new folks. I'd love for you to say hello in the chat. If you're not yet a member, I invite you to become one. Last week, Hillwood reopened with exclusive access just for our members. And now we're looking forward to welcoming the broader community on Tuesday, March 2nd, as we open to the general public. Of course, masks are required at all times, even if you're vaccinated. And we require advanced reservations with timed entry to ensure a safe capacity. As February comes to a close, we know that tonight is the final chapter in the 2021 Great Homes and Gardens series. This has been a great month of compelling stories, and I encourage you to revisit and share previous programs. They're all available on our YouTube channel. Now, of course, coming up, March is full of great Hillwood programming too. And I hope you'll join me on March 10th as rising scholar Kimberly St. Julian Varnon shares African-American experiences in the Soviet Union. March also brings a variety of engaging tours, as well as Hillwood's lush greenhouse right to your home with Orchid Month. Orchids are just the beginning of all of the beautiful blooms at Hillwood. The gardens will not be the only place that you can see incredible flowers in April. The mansion will be home to an exhibition of porcelain flowers by contemporary artist Vladimir Kanevsky. In June, 2 other exhibitions open, Roaring Twenties, finally, can't wait. And then a second contemporary installation, Christine May's Rich Soil. That is 29 life-size dancing figures constructed of wire that will transform the gardens. You can learn more by visiting the exhibitions page of our website. I'm very excited about tonight's speaker. Brent Leggs is the Executive Director of the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, the largest preservation campaign ever undertaken on behalf of African American history. Through the Action Fund, Brent leads a broad community of leaders and activists to preserve African American cultural sites that are fundamental to learning the American story. He is an associate professor and senior advisor to the newly founded Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites in the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2011, Brent served as Harvard University Loeb Fellow, and in 2018, he received the Robert G. Stanton National Preservation Award. Tonight, Brent will share many examples of his campaigns to protect cultural monuments. His efforts led President Barack Obama to designate the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument in Alabama, and his work to preserve Madam C.J. Walker's Villa Lewaro in New York are prime examples. You may remember that Alelia Bundles spoke at Hillwood about Villa Lewaro, and you can watch video of that wonderful program on our YouTube page if you haven't seen it yet. And even if you had, it's worth seeing again. You can submit questions for Brent as they crossed your mind using the Q&A module. Our moderator will make sure that we get to them at the end. It's now my pleasure to welcome Brent Leggs.
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. And I want to send greetings to everyone this evening. It's an honor to have this opportunity to share with you. So again, I am delighted to be with you all tonight, and it's an honor to close Hillwood's Black History Month program. So I want to just start by telling you my personal story and how I came to preservation. I'm from a little town called Paducah, Kentucky. If you hadn't heard of Paducah, it's a population of about 35,000, Western Kentucky. And the first memory that I have about preservation and architecture, so I have a twin brother, and we would ride in my parents' car going down Jefferson Avenue in this beautiful street that's lined with the most beautiful residential architecture. And we would play this game. This is my house. I'm gonna live in that house. And I'm sure some of you played that same game as kids. My favorite house was this Japanese-inspired two-story residence that had terracotta roof, and even to this day, I think it's so exquisite. But as I look back now, I could never imagine that I would be part of a community helping to preserve places important in African American history and American culture. For me, the work of preservation is both professional and personal. Fast forward years later, I would go to the University of Kentucky. I thought I was going to become a Wall Street tycoon and make a lot of money. And so I did the traditional business track. I got an undergrad in marketing. I got an MBA in finance. And I realized that corporate America didn't fit my personality. So I started this very intensive soul searching process for my professional identity. So I thought I was going to get a PhD in history. I even considered a PhD in philosophy, but realized I needed to speak fluently in a second language. So I scrapped that idea. And then I thought I discovered it. And that was to study furniture making in a program in the School of Architecture at the University of Kentucky. I would walk inside and have this unintentional random conversation with the Dean of the Graduate Preservation Program, Dr. Dennis Domer. And literally in that conversation, he used the power of preservation to convince me to take this chance. And oddly enough, I did. 2 months later, I was studying architectural history and learning about iconic columns and Gothic architecture. And I was questioning whether or not I made the right decision. But thankfully, they invited me to conduct the statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Rosenwald School story, but if you haven't, I think it really starts with understanding who Booker T. Washington is. He was formerly enslaved. He would, years later, would found Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which we know today as Tuskegee University. So when I read Up from Slavery, his autobiography, I was so impressed. And he has always been a historical mentor and someone that I really deeply admired and respected. But when I realized that he also was the founder of the Rosenwald schools, that this bold idea and vision was born in his mind, that he would partner with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the second president of Sears and Roebuck. He was empathetic of the plight of African Americans in the United States, being a Jewish American. And together they would help to fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. Over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. I learned that the original architect of the blueprints was the first African-American architect, Robert Taylor, first African-American graduate of MIT. The landscape designer was none other than George Washington Carver. I remember being at a school, literally, that was being held up by a tree, And as I interacted with the physical evidence of this story and of our shared past, I remember having this multi-sensory experience with this place. I heard the floorboards creak as I toured that abandoned school building. I could smell, literally, I could remember smelling the rot and the decay of the historic materials. I could see sunlight that was shining through the broken window panes. And when I walked outside of the school and I began to ask myself these questions, and I started to understand that preservation wasn't just about the past, that it also was about the present. It had this transcendent quality to the work, really an untapped potential. And that was because I began to realize that Booker T. Washington's vision for uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my life through my parents both attending Rosenwald schools. I believe deeply in the power of preservation to make Washington and Rosenwald's remarkable lives once lived. It makes it real. So I'm sure you've heard of a cultural icon known as Beyonce. I love this quote from her visual album, Lemonade. It says, "The past and the future merge to meet us here. The past and the future merge to meet us here." White America enslaved Black America for 250 years, creating a social disease that still lingers in all aspects of our society today. Does preservation have a role in helping to confront this cultural legacy? We are still fighting against cultural inequity. In 1853, Pamela Ann Cunningham would organize a group of women and they would create the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And in essence, they would birth the US preservation movement in their advocacy and effort to restore Mount Vernon, which was the home of President George Washington. It's here. This is an image of it here. That work being so important really created two different structures for the way we preserve American history based on architectural significance and association to white men of power. Today, our National Register of Historic Places, it has 100,000 plus entries in it, and only 2% reflects the Black experience in America. We've got a lot of catching up to do. We're fighting against urban renewal and erasure. This is an American story. There are so many African-American neighborhoods that have been decimated and erased. And you can imagine the loss of financial capital, the loss of culture, the loss of community. We're fighting against redlining and disinvestment. If you walk the streets of Baltimore, Chicago, there are examples of the impacts of redlining that has created historic built environments that look like this. I want to read something from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. For decades, low-income and minority communities were intentionally cut off from lending and investment through a system known as redlining. Today, those same neighborhoods suffer not only from reduced wealth and greater poverty, but from lower life expectancy and higher rates of chronic disease that are risk factors for COVID. Issues like this not only impact the physical environment, it literally impacts our community's health and well-being. We're fighting against racial terror. We all remember what happened in 2015 when a lone white nationalist went inside of a house of God and would assassinate and murder 9 church members. We've invested $150,000 to help this church recover and to restore their historic church sanctuary. This is an example of how some Americans express their cultural values in public space. This is a National Trust historic site in Nantucket, Massachusetts. This happened in 2018. This disrespect happened on the second oldest extant Black church building in the United States. This is part of the ongoing conversation. How do we memorialize history? What history deserves the prominence of our public and civic space? I want to read something for you that I wrote in the art newspaper, London. That was part of my op-ed. Pablo Picasso once said, "Art is the lie that enables us to realize the truth." Let the connection between public spaces and Confederate statues disappear, with ruins that will never be maintained again. These sites of conscience will remind nations never to forget the power of propaganda and racial politics cloaked with heritage and carried out with violence. Like an hourglass, where each falling grain of sand is pulled to the bottom by larger forces. Let this community of false heroes enjoy their own decay. Because the truth is that in the reality of this moment, Confederate monuments and their pride and prejudice are a vanishing history. And we continue to fight against systemic racism. So last summer, during the Black Lives Matter protest movement here in Washington, D.C., an unnamed protester would write these words on the side of the Decatur House, which is a National Trust historic site. It sits in the shadows of the White House. It's where African Americans were formerly held in bondage. And this protester wrote, "Why do we have to keep telling you Black lives matter?" I believe that our work in this moment, any of us that's part of the preservation community, that we have to stretch ourselves, that we have to reimagine what preservation practice looks like, that we are more than just the keepers of culture and stories. Just perhaps we're even more relevant than we ever thought we could be. This is a true statement. I think it sums it up. The goal is that we work never to repeat our past, and hopefully we have the courage to confront it. So preservation as social justice. I have the good fortune to be the founding executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It was created in the aftermath of Charlottesville in November of 2017. We remember this moment. It really was a cultural reckoning, unexpected in many ways. Maybe perhaps it wasn't. But to have white men who would connect heritage and public space and history and would rally around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of the University of Virginia at night holding tiki torches. They were advocating for a modern form of Jim Crow. We knew that this did not express our national values. We thought that preservation being part of a national discourse in a rare moment, that it was an opportunity for us to lead and to demonstrate that preservation could be used as a tool to help confront a cultural crisis. Thus, the largest preservation and fundraising campaign ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places, $25 million to support 150 African American landmarks. The Action Fund is about creating space. It's a platform and a movement based on our understanding of history, preservation, and social justice. We are working to create positive change in communities across the United States. In essence, we are working to redefine a new American culture and narrative for the purpose of helping to create a more just and equitable society. The first thing that we did was to create a new form of partnership and community, thus creating a National Advisory Council. We currently have a 20-member board. It is co-chaired by Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation, and actor and director, Miss Felicia Rashad. And given that we are sharing space during Black History Month, I want to acknowledge Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. She's the first African American to chair the history department of Harvard University, where Dr. Carter G. Woodson first Black graduate. He is the founder of Black History Week, which is now Black History Month. He also is the founder of Black History as an academic field. Dr. Higginbotham is the national president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which is the organization founded by Carter G. Woodson more than 100 years ago. Now, anyone involved in preservation understands it takes money to preserve history. And I'm glad to say that we have raised $25 million for phase one. We have supported and funded 150 projects. We're developing or finalizing a strategic plan for 2.0, which will launch this spring and launch another $25 million campaign. We've been intentional about leveraging our engagement with national media to leverage their voice, their creativity, their writing, to build a national ethic for the preservation of America's diverse historic places. Now I want to talk about the actual work. So we know James Madison to be the father of the Constitution. I hope you get a chance to tour this amazing historic site in Orange, Virginia. And the basement is where they have a permanent exhibition titled The Mere Distinction of Color. It not only brings life to the story and experience of the enslaved workers there, but it highlights the legacies of slavery and presents the Black experience over centuries, even to contemporary life. Building on that work, Montpelier has been engaging the descendant community for 2 decades. The Descendant Committee is now the formal nonprofit organization, and we are facilitating and exploring a shared governance and authority model that we hope will reimagine the traditional preservation practice at our iconic historic sites. Another National Trust historic site is the home of President Woodrow Wilson, known for his international policies that still live on today. Also known for segregating the federal government. We wanted to reimagine interpretation inside of a space like this. So we worked with artists and students that composed a new composition that highlighted the DC counter protest movement of the 1960s. They performed that piece of music playing the Wilson family piano inside of their home. And it was a moment where we had a diverse audience that we had never seen inside of this kind of historic space. And then there are places like Shaka Bottom in Richmond, Virginia, once the second largest slaveholding center in the United States. If you go to Richmond at this moment, Shaka Bottom is nothing more than an archaeological site. You'll see concrete and pavement and parking lots and a city streetscape. But beneath that pavement and concrete is a vast archaeological site that holds the memories of the enslaved Africans here, an African burial ground that's been paved over. So the community wants to memorialize this and to bring honor and recognition to their sacrifice. And we have helped them to develop a community-driven vision for memorialization that links together education and economic development. And this is what the community wants to see happen. Preservation as equity. One of the central pillars of the Action Fund is our national grant program. And I think these statistics really highlight that African American historic places have been underfunded and undervalued for decades. Almost 2,400 proposals requesting almost $250 million. Thus far, we have supported 65 communities and projects and invested $4.3 million. We'll invest another $1.6 million in July, thanks to our partnership with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And we've been able to help preserve places like the home of Paul Robeson in Philadelphia. This organization was started by Fran Alston, the late Fran Alston. The organization is more than 3 decades old. They've been all volunteer that entire time, and our funding is helping them to hire their first paid executive director that will strengthen their capacity to be a true community anchor and asset. I'm sure some of you have heard of the legendary John Coltrane. His wife, Alice, is also legendary. Inside of this ranch-style house, John spent a week in the second floor bedroom, isolated himself, and he composed, considered one of his greatest masterpieces, A Love Supreme. Years later, Alice would record her first 5 albums in their basement studio. This house is simple. Some might not consider it architecturally significant or beautiful, but the cultural heritage and legacy here has power to inspire a new generation of creatives that will honor the legacy of the Coltranes. But when we think about equitable interpretation, we also want to highlight an overlooked story, which is to tell the story of Black romantic love, to talk about this being a family home where they raise their children who are actively involved as part of the board in reimagining the future of this house. I'm sure some of you have heard of the legendary playwright, August Wilson. And if not, you probably have heard or saw the movie Fences, or even more recently, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Those are based on his plays. August Wilson literally used the historic Hill District in Pittsburgh as inspiration to talk about the Black experience. So we are supporting the nonprofit organization who's working to preserve his former home. But this is typical of many African historic places that have spatial constraints. So our funding supported an artist fellowship program so that they could maximize the landscape, the streetscape, as a way to leverage art to build community. Now let's travel to Los Angeles, California. Whiffendale Ladies Club. I remember when I toured this elegant historic space and met these remarkable women. When I learned about this story, 50 Black women during the period of segregation would pull together their resources, they would acquire this mansion, and they would create their own space, their own social club. This is reflective of the Black middle class experience in Los Angeles. That's a story that is overlooked, lesser known. And because of our effort to help them create a sustainable business model for the future of this site, I believe they have a bright future ahead of them. I hope some have heard about the legendary Pauli Murray. This is her childhood home in Durham, North Carolina. I have to say that I hadn't heard of Pauli Murray until probably about 5 or 6 years ago. Come to find out, Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. Come to find out that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dedicated her first briefing in memory of Pauli Murray. She is this powerful woman that few Americans know, and in many ways that is an injustice. Vernon AME Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is the 100th anniversary of the largest racial massacre in the United States. It happened in 1921 in historic Greenwood neighborhood in this city. The last standing remnant of that racial massacre is Vernon AME. When the community began the process of rebuilding, they would, as a fundraising strategy, members of the church would cover the cost of paying for a stained glass window. We provided $150,000 to help them to restore the stained glass windows in preparation for this anniversary. They've been able to leverage $750,000 in the process, working with a world-class stained glass window conservator out of Denver. Our work here is really about equitable interpretation, not to stay stuck in a painful past, but it's also to make sure that we don't forget that Greenwood was considered by Booker T. Washington as the Black Wall Street. It was a once thriving economic center. This community had their own dentist offices, bowling alleys, theaters. It was prosperous and the center of economic prosperity for Black Americans in Oklahoma. We got to make sure that we tell that story as well. And then there are places like Claiborne Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1968, Dr. King would lead 15,000 protesters to City Hall, part of the sanitation workers' strike. This really is an example where the civil rights movement became more sophisticated. Of course, it was about political activism, but it also became about economic justice. The I Am a Man posters that you see here were designed and pressed in the basement of the church. We have helped this organization to establish a nonprofit called Historic Claiborne Reborn. We have funded their first preservation manager position and more. And through our partnership with Veranda Magazine, the first feature in a series came out this month, and it highlights Claiborne Temple. It really is a fascinating piece if you get a chance to read it. And then there are places that tell the story of cultural icons like Nina Simone. We all know that Nina Simone transcended constraints placed on Black female performers in the mid 20th century to become the voice of the American civil rights movement. You probably remember her song, Mississippi Goddamn, that she composed and created in the aftermath of the 16th Street church bombing in September of 1963. 4 New York City-based visual artists saved this house from demolition. And as a form of arts activism and politics, they have partnered with the National Trust. We are leading the development of a stewardship plan to increase public access, interpretation, and to identify a permanent business model that will sustain the storytelling in perpetuity. But equally as important, this place is located in Tryon, North Carolina, with a population of 2,500. So our goal is to stimulate a new creative economy through historic preservation. All of these examples represents the work of preserving American culture. Like the home of Madam C.J. Walker. So Kate teased this in her opening remarks, highlighting Alelia Bundle, who is Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter and the leading biographer about Madam Walker. And we collaborated in an effort to protect Madam Walker's beloved estate in perpetuity. The National Trust now holds its first preservation easement to protect both exterior and partial interiors on this property. It sits in Irvington, New York, and it's an elegant historic residence that embodies the perseverance of American entrepreneurship. Madam Walker was born in 1867 in Delta, Louisiana, first person in her family born free. She would create a formula to help Black women's hair grow and to be healthy. And in the process, would train 23,000 sales agents and beauty culturalists, would become America's first self-made female millionaire. And she would build this grand estate at a cost of $250,000 in 1918, designed by architect Vertner Tandy, first licensed Black architect in the state of New York. What I love about this story is she would select this location and integrate the most expensive zip code in the United States at the time. Her house sits on the same street as Jay Gould's Lyndhurst, considered the most significant Gothic revival architecture in the United States. This house sits 3 miles from the Rockefeller State Kikit. A woman did all of this before women had the right to vote. And in her will, and I'm paraphrasing, but she said something like, I leave this estate as in memoriam, as a monument or museum to inspire my race to reach its highest potential. Madam Walker was an early preservationist. This house holds exceptional architectural integrity. It's both architecturally and culturally significant. Even though the furnishings are not original, look at the coffered ceilings and the detailing, that's all original, even the chandelier. I love this photo. Hand-painted ceilings on a coffered ceiling. Look at the detail inside of this house. A place that is beloved to me is the A.G. Gaston Motel. I first learned about this place when the city of Birmingham had plans to partially demolish the 1968 portion of this mid-century modern hotel that was constructed in 1954 by A.G. Gaston. He was the most successful entrepreneur during the period of segregation in Birmingham. And I bet he never imagined that in the spring of 1963, the entire civil rights movement would descend on this space. They would develop and implement from the hotel the Birmingham campaign known as Project C. And in the process would break the back of segregation across the South. And when I think of the role of mid-century modern architecture to ensure that the contributions of Black men, women, children, and our allies who really tested and affirmed this timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world, that places like this motel, they have a story to tell. They hold imbued power. And that power doesn't live in the images of the barking dogs, of the violent police officers, or the fire hoses. The cultural power lives in the Black community organizing, developing a shared vision, directing their limited resources to advance that vision, sustaining a commitment to the implementation of that vision that would influence local and national public policy. When we preserve places like the A.G. Gaston and this cultural legacy, it provides lessons and wisdom for our community and our nation in this present moment. And I'm glad to say that the Gaston Motel that had been vacant for more than 20 years is well on its way to being fully restored. This is Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who introduced the legislation to create the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. She's got the red jacket. And the current project manager, Denise Gilmore, who works for the city of Birmingham. My last section is about creating space. Through the Action Fund, we are intentional about creating space for new ideas and new voices. And one way that we do that is through our fellowship program. Brianna Rhodes is a freelance journalist who writes about our Action Fund grantees. Candace Taylor is the leading cultural documentarian on Green Books. And if you haven't read her book, Overground Railroad, it's awesome. It's a highly recommended read. And she is identifying Green Book sites in Harlem that are eligible for listing in the National Register. Yoruba Richin, who produced the Smithsonian Channel's Green Book documentary on the Green Book, is producing a short doc on our work to preserve the Langston Hughes House in Harlem. And Jenna helped to co-author our equity study that came out in October. We also have our Hope Crew program, which stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience. We are introducing youth between the ages of 18 to 25, preservation trades. These are paid positions. So it's not only to create a new generation of craft professionals, but the conservators are aging in place. And so we have to find new solutions to mitigate what is a real crisis and the way that the crisis and having the infrastructure necessary to ensure that we have qualified professionals helping to care for and maintain our historic buildings. And then a program that I'm really proud of is our Historically Black Colleges and Universities Cultural Heritage Stewardship Initiative. We just launched a $1 million pilot in partnership with the National Endowment for Humanities and 4 other partners. And just last week, we made our announcement that we selected 8 HBCUs to partner with, and we are funding individual building plans and 2 campus-wide preservation plans to equip HBCUs with the knowledge and information to steward their cultural assets. Many of these buildings designed by early pioneering Black architects, but we're also working with their schools of design to cultivate the next generation of Black professionals in historic preservation. So in essence, I think it is appropriate to read the words of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world void of national bias, race, hate, and religious prejudice. As we recognize the contributions of African Americans during Black History Month, both the struggle and achievement, let's also remember the accomplishments of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. So our work moving forward and in this moment is to begin the process of reverence and upliftment of Black culture and assets as American history. We have to continue to partner and develop new ways to reduce historical inequities. And we must define quantitative, measurable, equity-driven outcomes to measure our success. This is American history. This is our collective and shared history. So I will leave you with this. The past and the present merge to meet us here. What future can we create together to leverage and harness the power of preservation to build a more just and equitable society for all Americans? Thank you.
That was fabulous. And among my favorite parts were thinking about all the stories you spoke about with the Coltrane House and how the relatively simple structures are what makes a great American site. They are the source of those artistic visions and businesses, raising families. And that's exactly the type of story that I love about historic homes and gardens. And I'm really grateful that the Trust is continuing to make space to preserve all of American history and all of our stories. Before I go too much further, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Erin Lurie, and I manage Hillwood's adult public programs. I am moderating the Q&A this evening. So please, we've got a couple of great questions that have come in already. But if you'll see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, please pull that toolbar up and don't be shy. We want to hear from you. Brent, as you were speaking, we got a couple of really great comments coming in, including one that just mentions, again, going to the Coltrane home, that A Love Supreme is this member's favorite albums, and that folks are really eager to make visits to all of these extraordinary sites that you talked about today and more. So we had a couple of questions about whether there is a list of sites that the Action Fund has already worked towards preserving so that folks can fill out their travel itineraries.
Well, I hate to share some disappointing news, but this is reflective of really the through line in my presentation. We have been really funding planning activities, whether on the preservation and business side. The majority of the places that I showed are still vacant. And it's our hope that in phase 2 that we can scale up the investment so that we can fast track these preservation projects and make them available to the public, because these are the spaces that, again, creates community. Like, how awesome would it be to go for this fan that loves Coltrane and to literally stand in that bedroom that still has the original wallpaper and to listen to A Love Supreme? So it's our goal, and the goal of these organizations that do this hard work every single day, that are scraping by with pennies and are building their own capacity and fundraising and nonprofit management and all of the hard work it takes to be a successful historic site. Hopefully in the next couple of years that we'll see significant progress, and we'll be able to have a whole itinerary and map and hopefully a formal kind of tour, kind of a travel tour experience for Americans and visitors.
Well, we will look forward to that, and we will definitely all be vaccinated by then, so it should be easy to get out and about. While the work is ongoing and large, a couple of folks have asked if there's a way that they can keep abreast of progress in that preservation. Dee Dee was particularly interested in Nina Simone's childhood home, but a couple of folks also asked generally about a newsletter for the Action Fund, or where they can see progress and what's happening and how they can help.
Yeah, so you can go to savingplaces.org, and you can always Google the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, but our website is savingplaces.org. And we just did a refresh of the Action Fund webpage.
I noticed that earlier today. It's different than it was at the beginning of the month, I feel.
It is, it's different. And we kind of released it this month, and we'll probably do a different edit at some point. But we needed to organize because our work is so substantial, and bring some structure to the way that we're presenting, because we get these similar questions all the time. And you can go to the projects tab and begin to see and follow some of our progress. And then we are currently exploring whether or not to create a podcast, something that will allow listeners to have kind of weekly updates or more consistent updates. And then we have a newsletter that comes out every quarter. So for anyone that wants to get on that mailing list, I would say email us at savingplaces.org.
Excellent. Jeffrey Hirsch asked if part of the business plan is not only to fund, and I think you've spoken a little bit about this, to fund the storytelling and the programming, the preservation of individual sites, but how that might be connected into a network or bigger stories.
Yeah, so in many ways, it's hard to look at one individual site and not see it as a part of a collective and part of a national story. Whether it's Hotel Metropolitan in my hometown of Paducah, that's a Green Book site that was constructed in 1909 and owned by two African-American women, and using something that's local to talk about a national story like Madam C.J. Walker and the role of Black female entrepreneurs. And that Madam Walker wasn't the only woman like that, or thinking about Mary and Eliza Freeman and their story of entrepreneurship in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The big goal, and in the near future, is to conduct a national documentation and mapping project. For many reasons, it's to create what we're discussing now, but I want to move the preservation movement to become more proactive in the way we engage and help to eliminate threats and preserve places. And really the best way to identify those opportunities is understanding and documenting and mapping the Black experience nationally. And hopefully I can bring together some amazing partners in IT and preservation and academia to launch that in a year or so.
Well, again, something that we are looking forward to. Althea asked how the Smithsonian African American History and Culture Museum has impacted the Trust's work in the Action Fund, and is there a tension between preservation on site and the collection of artifacts for the Smithsonian?
So, good question. Personally, I had some tension when the museum was first being built. Clearly for me, it was the most glorious kind of aspiration, knowing that the Black community had been advocating for the creation of this for more than 100 years, for at least 100 years, and that it was being manifested in such a prominent location, designed by Black architects, and inspired, that architecture inspired by African and African-American cultural heritage. I mean, just, I can't say enough about the museum. But when I heard that the museum was collecting a historic slave cabin in northern Kentucky and relocating that back, my concern was, you move something from its historic context, site context, and it loses some understanding, it loses meaning. And I had this fear that they were going to start to literally just start consuming culture, material culture. Of course, that did not happen. And thankfully, Dr. Lonnie Bunch, when he was as founding director, joined the board of the Action Fund. And he said to me, that the National Trust and the Action Fund's responsibility is to preserve the places where history happened. And that's exactly what we're doing.
We've got lots of great comments about how fascinating the talk is. One theme that seems to come up a couple of times is what criteria you use to determine what projects to fund or which houses to help save, and whether there is involvement with local and state governments as part of that.
Yeah, so mainly for our demonstration projects like Nina Simone, Gaston, Villa Lawaro, Coltrane, these are nationally significant places. They have strong local support, both at the mayor's office to the community and the nonprofit or property owner that stewards that place. And then through our grant program, we are funding projects that help us to fill gaps in American history. We have a deep commitment to elevating the contribution of Black women in American history. So we're looking for stories that are not known about the Black female contribution. And we are looking for projects that have national models or replicable models that other communities can follow to be able to steward the culture. And there are so many other different criteria that we follow. But I would say that's, for me, some of the biggest things that I'm looking for. A good story, interesting approach to preservation. If it's filling some gaps, whether it's culturally, geographically.
It's a big task, and it's a long list of criteria that you have to weigh. And I'm so glad that you're embarking on your second major fund to help continue this work. You mentioned just now specifically talking about the contributions of Black women. I had not heard of Polly Murray before, and one of our visitors asked if there's a biography or an autobiography that you'd recommend about her.
So I haven't seen this yet, and unfortunately I missed it, but there is a new documentary film that the same producer that did RGB, a Ruth Bader Ginsburg documentary, and it just screened virtually at Sundance. And it will be released here soon, and it's all about Polly Murray. So look out for that. I hear that it is awesome, and I can't wait to see it.
Excellent. And along that same line of more folks working to preserve African-American history and cultural sites, the Smithsonian website does have some great biographies of notable folks, including Polly Murray, and that may also point you in the direction of some biographies. Kim mentioned that she loved the weaving of the past and the present, and wondered what you hope visitors will take away from these landmarks and how they become actively involved in the conversations and discussions about sorry, I've lost. about how they'll get involved in the national conversations and discussions about systemic racism, current activist movements.
The beauty of historic places is they're a neutral space. They are community spaces. They are a safe haven for having difficult conversations about race in America. And many historic sites, whether it stewards a diverse narrative and story, or a place like Montpelier, they are bringing people together to talk about race and reconciliation, truth and healing. So I would say browse and look, try to identify a historic site in your community, go to their website, reach out, call them, and ask if they can put you in touch with a cultural space like this that is having that kind of conversation. Is likely on Zoom at this point. But, you know, I can't wait until we get past COVID so that people can actually share space again and be inside of a historic site that is grounded by the culture. You know, you can imagine being inside of the Paul Robeson House in Philadelphia, given his legacy in arts and politics and activism, and talking about race relations or inequity in Philly. That's the perfect place to do that. So,
Victoria asked how you feel that places like Mount Vernon and Monticello, and you mentioned Montpelier, is doing a fantastic job of sharing the history of the Black people who lived and worked on the estates, and what you hope they might do in order to better address this history.
yeah, for me, I think the work of shared governance and authority. So when you think of all of these sites, the majority of people that lived there were enslaved. They were Black Americans that lived there. And their claim to that land, to the history, is just as viable as the father of the Constitution or Thomas Jefferson and others. So it's about equalizing these conflicted narratives. It's about understanding that the descendants of the formerly enslaved have as much claim to that history and to that property as the other community. So for me, the real power is in shared governance, in shared authority, and identifying a new stewardship approach for presidential homes, for sites of enslavement.
I think the rest of our questions fall pretty much neatly into a category about whether the trust is involved with particular sites or particular areas, and whether the Action Fund is involved with the development of the Josiah Henderson site, which is in North Bethesda, and the Howard Theater was another local spot that folks were inquiring about.
So I'm not sure if we were involved in the rehabilitation of Howard Theater, but I have been there many times for fun and social life. And I just think it is the coolest space and has such a rich cultural legacy. And given the cultural shifts in Washington, D.C. over the last couple of decades, the fact that it still stands in its glory, fully restored, even though being adapted for contemporary use, is really important and something that I'm proud of my city to see that. The other place in Bethesda, haven't been connected to that project at all, and would love to learn more about the efforts and activities there. So Judy, send us an email or send Erin something and she can connect us. And then I saw that there was a comment about Martha's Vineyard, and I have taken that Black Heritage Trail tour. The history is rich. That's why I highlight that photo of Nantucket, because typically we don't think about racism being that far in the north, but it has lived in places like Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. But the history of Martha's Vineyard, I mean, it's so rich. And I would love to identify some opportunities to help preserve or elevate the work that's already happening there to tell that story. So for the listener, if you are connected to anyone behind a preservation project on Martha's Vineyard to help interpret and preserve the Black history there, connect with Erin. She'll help you get in touch with me. I don't think we've received a grant program to our national grant program for Martha's Vineyard yet, and would love to, again, to assist.
Fantastic. Brent, this has been wonderful, and I have so appreciated your time and sharing these fantastic and very important stories with our visitors. Those of you who joined us today, we are so pleased to have wrapped up a month of fabulous Great Homes and Gardens programs. When this webinar ends, you'll be automatically redirected to a short survey. Please take a moment to share your feedback. And for those of you who are in the DC area, I do invite you to come and visit Hillwood soon. And for those of you who are not, I hope that we'll see you at an online program coming up soon. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful night.